All right, everybody, welcome back to the deep dive, where we, like we always say, we take the stuff that really matters, all that information, and we try to make it understandable, you know, make it fast,
That's right.
so you can get smart, quickly.
Exactly.
That's what we're all about here.
Absolutely.
So today we're gonna be tackling, like a really big topic.
Yeah, big one.
We're looking at Equileap's 2025 report, and this
Yes.
is all about, women's equality in the workplace.
Yes, across developed markets.
Across developed markets.
That's right. And this is a not just a little, a small report. It's like a
Oh.
huge,
Massive, yeah.
massive 3,547 publicly listed companies.
Yeah, they really, they went deep on this one.
They did.
And Equileap, they look at everything.
Yeah, they do.
They look at, gender balance across all the different levels of leadership. They look at the pay gap, of course.
Of course.
Parental leave policies.
What that looks like, yeah.
What that looks like, policies around sexual harassment.
Mhm.
I mean, really, top to bottom kind of stuff.
Yeah, they really try to give us a full picture of what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what we want to do in this deep dive today is we're going to pull out, those key trends. We want to find the things that kind of make you go, huh?
Right, exactly. The stuff that really sticks out.
Yeah, and see, where are we actually seeing progress? And maybe even more interestingly, where are we not seeing progress?
Yeah, where are things stalled or even going backwards.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And we're mainly focusing on their press message and then also their global findings report specifically for developed markets. And we'll be taking a quick look at their webinar as well, which gives us some really helpful background on how they put all this information together.
Yeah, how they do their work, what their methodology is like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right into it. What is the headline here?
Yeah, so the main thing that Equileap is saying is that progress on women's equality in developed markets has basically stalled.
Stalled.
It's kind of hit a wall. And it's interesting because we are seeing, more conversation, more data being shared.
More awareness.
More awareness, exactly. But then when you look at the actual numbers,
Right.
in a lot of key areas, they're just not moving.
Yeah.
And in some cases, they're actually going down.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. Let's start with who's in charge.
Right.
You would think that after all of this attention, all this talk, all this focus, that we would see more women, at the very top of companies.
Yes. You would think so.
But what does the report actually show?
So the report shows that the percentage of women CEOs is stuck at 7%.
7%.
And board chairs at just 9%. And that's actually the same as last year.
Wow.
So no movement at all.
No movement. So it's really like, we talk the talk, but we're not walking the walk.
Yeah, it seems like it.
When it comes to, those top leadership positions.
Yeah. And what's really fascinating or maybe frustrating, depending on how you look at it, is that this lack of progress
Right.
kind of continues as you look at the roles just below CEO and board chair.
Okay.
So the global percentage of women in executive roles is 22%,
Okay.
and senior management roles is 27%.
Okay.
And those haven't really changed from last year either.
Wow. So it's
Not at
really
all.
painting a picture of like, there's this barrier.
A persistent barrier.
A persistent barrier. And it's, it's pretty solid. It's not budging.
It's not budging.
It's not budging yet.
Yet, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully we'll
Yeah.
see some movement on that. But it's not a uniform picture, right?
Right.
Across all the countries that they looked at, there were some pretty significant declines, actually,
Yeah, that's right.
in the percentage of women CEOs in certain countries.
Yeah, so they highlighted Austria, Denmark, and Finland
Okay.
as places where we actually saw a drop in the number of women CEOs.
Wow. So that definitely feels like a step in the wrong direction.
It does. Yeah, it makes you wonder what is happening in those countries specifically.
Yeah. What's going on there that's causing this kind of decline?
Yeah, is it shifts in the main industries that are in those countries,
Right.
or changes in government policies,
Could be.
about gender equality, or maybe even like broader economic factors.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of potential factors there.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right?
Oh, no, not at all.
The report also highlights some bright spots, some places that are actually making, some real strides.
Absolutely.
And Singapore really stands out.
Yeah, they really do.
They saw a huge jump in their percentage of women CEOs.
They did. It went from 9% to 15%.
Wow, that's a big jump.
It was a significant increase. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're now actually leading
Yeah,
developed markets in women CFOs with a really impressive 40%.
40%. Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, and that makes a country like Sweden, which has 23%,
Right.
look pretty different.
Yeah, it really highlights the variation
Yeah.
that exists across different countries.
Yeah. And so Singapore's progress really shows that meaningful change is possible
It is.
when there's a focused effort.
Right. And maybe
Like,
supportive policy environments,
yeah, maybe there are some policies in place that are really helping to drive that.
potentially.
Yeah, so it gives us kind of a model to look at.
Yeah, a potential model for what works.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about the gender pay gap now.
Okay.
There's been so much, attention on this and a big push for companies to be more transparent about it.
Yeah, to open up about what their numbers actually look like.
Okay. Yeah, and the report shows that the number of companies that are disclosing their gender pay gap, actually went up quite a bit.
It did. Yeah, it went from 33% to 44%.
So that's a pretty good increase.
It is. Yeah, more transparency is always a good thing in general, right?
Yeah. Right. It allows us to see where those disparities are.
Exactly. And it can create some pressure for change.
Yeah. So that's great. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Despite more companies talking about the pay gap,
Yeah.
the percentage of companies that have actually closed it has gone down.
Yeah, it's gone down. It went from a very small 1.1% to an even smaller 1%.
So only 36 companies out of all those thousands
Out of those thousands, yeah.
that they surveyed have actually eliminated their gender pay gap.
Right.
That's it.
That's it.
That's pretty crazy.
It really shows how challenging this issue is.
Yeah, it shows that, just talking about it
Right.
isn't enough.
It's not enough to actually create that equality
Yeah.
in terms of pay.
Yeah, and the report points to countries like Japan, Australia, and Hong Kong,
Mhm.
where we've seen, big jumps in disclosure.
Yeah, Japan's rate went from just 8% to a whopping 92%.
Wow.
That's a huge increase.
Huge increase.
But the really important thing to understand here is that just revealing the gap doesn't mean that it's being fixed.
Right.
Disclosure is a really important first step,
For sure.
but it's not the solution in and of itself.
Right. So where does the U.S. stand on all of this?
Yeah.
When it comes to, the pay gap and that transparency? The report didn't paint a very pretty picture, did it?
No, it didn't. The U.S. is actually pretty far behind when it comes to transparency around the gender pay gap.
Okay.
Only 17% of U.S. companies are disclosing their pay gaps.
Wow.
And that is the lowest rate among all the developed markets that they included in this report.
Wow. So we're really lagging behind.
Yeah, we are quite a bit behind.
Okay. So we've got leadership that seems to be kind of stuck. We've got, more companies showing their pay gap numbers, but very few actually closing the gap. What about overall representation of women at different levels within companies?
So that the overall trend here is also one of stagnation.
Stagnation. Okay.
For most levels within these companies, the percentage of women really hasn't changed much from last year.
Okay.
The one kind of small positive is at the board level, where we've seen a slight increase from 30% to 32%.
Okay, so even that small bump still leaves us a long way
Oh, yeah, a long way.
from having an equal number of men and women on boards.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how many companies are actually achieving something close to balance throughout their entire organization?
Right.
Equileap defines gender balance as having between 40 and 60% women.
Mm-hmm.
So how many companies are hitting that across the board?
The number is really small. It's only 1.1% of companies.
Okay.
And that translates to 38 companies out of all the companies they looked at.
Wow, so a tiny fraction.
A tiny fraction
Yeah.
of the total number.
And that's a slight increase from the previous report where it was 0.8%.
Okay.
But it's still a very small number.
Yeah, so we're not seeing, widespread adoption
No.
of these, gender balance practices.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
And are there, certain parts of the world where we're seeing better gender balance in companies?
Yes, there are definitely some regional differences.
Europe is leading the way in terms of women on boards.
Okay.
They have an average of 39%,
Okay.
while North America has a slight edge when it comes to women in executive roles, senior management, and workforce representation.
Okay.
But unfortunately, the Asia-Pacific region is lagging behind in all of these areas.
Okay, interesting. So let's drill down on the U.S. for a minute.
Okay.
The press message called it one of the worst performers in developed markets.
Yeah, they did.
So can we dig into that a little bit?
Absolutely.
Why is that the case?
So when you look at Equileap's overall gender equality score,
Mm-hmm.
the average for U.S. companies is lower than the UK, Canada, and the average for all developed markets.
Okay.
And in fact, the U.S. only scores better than Hong Kong, Israel, and Japan.
Wow. So we're really at the bottom of the barrel here.
Yeah, we're not doing so great.
And in specific areas like, board representation, are we behind some of our closest peers as well?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So in the U.S., women make up about 32% of board members,
Okay.
whereas in the U.K., it's 43%, and in Canada, it's 38%.
Okay.
And as we mentioned, the number of U.S. companies that have achieved that gender balance across all levels is very low and has actually decreased slightly since the last report.
And it's interesting that the report, points out that Singapore and Hong Kong are now ahead of the U.S.
Yeah.
in several of these measures, which is, that's kind of a significant shift.
It is, yeah. It shows that, progress isn't inevitable.
Right.
Really requires focus and effort.
Yeah. And of course, the U.S. has that really low rate of gender pay gap transparency
Right.
that we talked about.
That's right. And it remains the only developed country without any national legislation mandating paid parental leave.
Yeah, that lack of national paid leave seems like a pretty big, disadvantage.
It does, yeah. It's a fundamental difference
Yeah.
between the U.S. and a lot of other developed countries.
So what about the UK?
Oh,
The report suggests that they're doing better than the U.S. overall.
yes. The UK's average score has actually improved, and they now rank third
Okay.
among developed markets behind France and Spain.
Okay.
And they've seen progress in representation of women at the board, executive, and management levels.
Okay.
Their workforce representation has stayed steady at 40%,
Okay.
which means they actually meet that definition of gender balance.
Okay, so they've achieved gender balance
Yeah.
at both the board and workforce level.
That's right.
That's great.
Yeah, that's definitely a positive.
Yeah. Are there any areas where they're still falling short?
Yes. So while they have made progress in publishing policies against sexual harassment,
Okay.
their rate of publication is still lower than many other developed nations.
Okay.
And also, the UK does have statutory parental leave,
Mm-hmm.
but the level of pay that's provided during that leave doesn't meet Equileap standards for, what would be considered adequate support.
Okay, so they've got the leave, but they're not necessarily paying people enough
Exactly. It's not really enough to make it feasible.
to make it feasible for people to take it.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at the countries at the top of the list.
Okay.
France and Spain,
Mm-hmm.
which are tied for the highest average gender equality score.
Yeah, tied for first place.
What are they doing well, and were there any surprises in their results?
So France actually, despite their top ranking overall,
Okay.
has seen a decrease in representation of women in top leadership roles, like CEO, CFO, and board chair.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is a little surprising.
Given that they're, doing so well overall.
Right, you would think that those things would go hand in hand,
Yeah.
but that's not necessarily what the data is showing.
But they do still have the highest percentage of women on company boards globally, right?
Yes, they do. And that's largely attributed to legislation in France
Okay.
that mandates gender balance on boards.
Okay.
However, their transparency when it comes to the gender pay gap is actually lower
Okay.
than a lot of other leading European countries.
Interesting.
On a positive note, they do have a very high rate of companies publishing their anti-sexual harassment policies. So that's good.
Good.
Yeah.
And what about Spain,
Okay.
the other country at the top?
Yeah, so Spain has actually shown significant improvement and now shares that top spot with France.
Okay.
They lead in both gender pay gap and anti-sexual harassment policy transparency.
Okay.
And this is also linked to legislation
Okay.
that requires pay gap disclosure.
Okay. So they've got laws in place
They do.
to help drive that.
Yeah.
But despite that high level of transparency, only one Spanish company.
Okay. Has actually closed its gender pay gap.
So again, we're seeing that theme
Right.
of transparency doesn't necessarily equal action.
As an equal action, exactly.
And they still lag behind other European nations in the representation of women in top executive and leadership positions.
Yeah, and interestingly, they have a significantly higher percentage of women serving as chairs of the board
Okay.
compared to the global average.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's some interesting nuances
Yeah, for sure.
in the data.
Yeah. It really highlights that, laws can push for that transparency, but they don't automatically guarantee that those underlying inequalities
Right.
are being addressed.
You need more than just laws
Exactly.
to create real change.
What about Switzerland? How are they doing?
So Switzerland's average score has improved, but they're still lagging behind most other European countries in the report.
Okay.
They have seen increased representation of women at all levels, within companies, but those levels are still below the European averages.
Okay.
And they also have a very low rate of gender pay gap transparency.
Okay.
And similar to Spain, only one Swiss company has actually closed its pay gap.
Okay.
So again, we're seeing that same theme popping up.
The report also takes a closer look at the financial sector.
Yes.
Were there any, specific trends or interesting findings within that industry?
Yes. So the financial sector's average gender equality score is actually lower
Okay.
than some other sectors,
Hmm.
even though we see quite a few financial companies represented in that top 10 list.
Interesting.
Yeah. And interestingly, their workforce is actually gender balanced
Okay.
at 50% women.
Okay.
But there is a noticeable drop-off of women in leadership positions.
Okay. So they're there in the workforce, but not making it up to those top spots.
Right. And they have shown a slow but steady increase in female leaders over the years.
Okay. So some progress,
Some progress, yeah,
but still a lot of work to do.
definitely.
And what about things like pay equity and parental leave policies within the financial sector?
Okay, so transparency around the gender pay gap has increased a lot in the financial sector.
Okay.
But again, only one financial company reported actually closing that gap.
Okay.
So that thing continues.
Continues.
But on a more positive note, this sector actually stands out as the best performing
Okay.
when it comes to offering paid company-sponsored parental leave.
Yes, that's good.
It is good, yeah.
Yeah.
But their rate of publishing anti-sexual harassment policies is below the global average.
Okay, interesting. So it seems like, looking across all of these findings, there's a very clear pattern that emerges.
There is.
We're seeing, more and more companies providing data on things like the gender pay gap and, their policies around these issues. But that increased transparency isn't necessarily translating into real measurable progress.
Yeah, that's right. Transparency is great. It's a vital first step.
It's a starting point.
Yeah, it allows us to see the problems, more clearly.
Sure.
But it's not a substitute for concrete actions.
Right.
And a real commitment from companies to actually make changes.
Yeah, you can't just, put out a report and say, okay, we're done.
Right, exactly. It's not a box to check.
Yeah, and the report even mentions the fact that companies with better gender balance tend to perform better financially.
They do.
They talk about indices like the selective Equileap, U.S. Gender Equality Tilt Index, and the Morningstar Japan Gender Diversity Tilt Index.
Yeah.
So, this seems like a pretty compelling reason for companies to actually prioritize this.
It is. Yeah, Equileap's research and, the performance of these indices really suggests a link between gender balance and financial success.
Yeah.
Diverse teams often bring a wider range of perspectives,
Right.
which can lead to better decision-making, and companies that are seen as, equitable are often more successful at attracting and retaining top talent.
Right.
So the fact that this financial incentive doesn't seem to be driving more widespread action
Right.
is really kind of interesting.
It is. Yeah. It's like, what are we waiting for?
Yeah, exactly.
There's a clear, benefit here. Finally, the report briefly mentions a trend that they're calling DEI rollbacks.
Yes.
Particularly in the U.S., and I think for our listeners, DEI rollbacks refer to the reductions in initiatives focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion within organizations.
Right, scaling back those programs.
Yeah. So what could be the impact of this, on future progress and our ability to actually track it?
So this is a potentially concerning development. If companies are scaling back their initiatives that were aimed at things like representational goals, supplier diversity, and ensuring diverse candidate pools, it could definitely, slow down or even reverse some of the progress that we've seen.
Right. And it could also make it harder to even get the data in the future.
Exactly. It could lead to less transparency, particularly in the U.S., even as global disclosure requirements are kind of, generally increasing.
So the U.S. might be moving in the opposite direction.
It could be, yeah.
And that could have, ripple effects across the globe.
It could.
Okay, so to bring it all together, it looks like we're in a situation where there's more data about gender equality in the workplace.
Yeah, more awareness.
More awareness.
Yep.
When you look at those key metrics of women in leadership and the gender pay gap,
Right.
progress has really stalled.
Yeah, it's kind of plateaued.
Yeah, and some parts of the world are showing more promise than others, which tells us that, change is definitely possible.
Absolutely.
When it's made a real priority.
Yeah, when companies and governments put their minds to it,
Right.
things can change.
So the key takeaway here is that, simply knowing the numbers isn't enough.
Exactly. Transparency is great. It's a powerful tool,
Right.
but it has to be paired with action
Right.
and a genuine commitment from companies to achieve real gender equality.
It's not about checking a box. It's about making a real change.
Real change.
And the financial advantages of doing so are becoming, more and more clear.
They are, yeah.
That a lot of companies aren't fully embracing this opportunity.
Yeah, it's a missed opportunity for sure.
So it really leaves us with a question for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Given all of this, increased awareness about the numbers, but the lack of significant progress, what are the real obstacles?
Yeah, what's holding companies back?
What's holding companies back from achieving true gender equality in the workplace?
Yeah.
And what's it going to take to actually turn this awareness into real, tangible change?
Right. How do we move from talk to action?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about,
Yeah, for sure.
in your own professional lives and in the broader economy.
In the world around us.
Yeah, and if you're interested in digging into this more, you can find Equileap's full report and all of their other research on their website. It's www.equileap.com.
That's right.
So check it out.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.